Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. Today we're going to be looking at a subgenre of games that I'm trying to call asshole simulators. Really is what they are. Postal and Hatred are games where you play a psychotic mass murderer. Postal 2 and 3 are games where you play a psychotic mass murderer with jokes. All of these games are predicated on the idea that they are controversial and offensive, but not to the player, right? So we're going to be getting deep into how the games are designed and why the games are designed that way and how it actually turns out for each of the titles and all the expansions for Postal 2 as well. Let's get into it.
The first video game ever to be banned from sale due to objectionable content was Death Race, an arcade cabinet from 1976. In it, you drive a little pixelated car and try to run down gremlins who would gurgle a digital death rattle and be replaced by a tombstone, which would wreck your car if you hit it. The more gremlins you could kill without hitting their tombstones, the higher your score. It's just dots on a screen anyway. How could anyone have gotten so upset about it? Death Race was something culturally new in 1976, a game with a sadistic premise. It's not the pixels that bothered people. The game was bloodless. You weren't even running down pedestrians. They were tiny stick figures that the game said were monsters. What made people so uncomfortable, what made retailers and arcade owners too nervous to actually stock the machine, was the idea that they were selling a self-indulgently violent fantasy. They were already in the fantasy sales business, but how deep did the rabbit hole go? What kind of fantasies were marketable and which were too far? Flash forward to 1997, the year Postal was released. While Postal was coming out, the groundbreakingly violent first-person shooter Doom was seeing its day in court. Lawyer Jack Thompson, in the wake of the Heath High shootings, sued not only id Software, but several other game developers, as well as 2 porn websites and the distributors of the movies Natural Born Killers and, weirdly, The Basketball Diaries, which features a scene of fantasy violence that Thompson argued influenced the Heath High shooter. Thompson was trying to sue pop culture itself. The shooting was horrific, as was Columbine, as have been every one of the hundreds of school shootings since 1997. But the shooter's preoccupation with video game violence was an expression of mental instability and not the cause. In 2001, an appeals court finally dismissed the case, saying it was, quote, simply too far a leap from shooting characters on a video screen to shooting people in a classroom. Postal was never included in this lawsuit. It had just been released when proceedings began. And that's for the best. It brought some interesting and complicated new dimensions to the argument. How do you defend a game about doing the indefensible? What place in popular culture does a murder simulation have? I'm not being hyperbolic. That's the premise. You play a psychopathic killer on a murder spree. Once you've killed enough people, a majority percentage, you can move on to the next level. Like Death Race, what is controversial is the context, the idea that it's a game with sadism as the central premise, with no mitigating layer of aliens or monsters or world-saving. It's just killing for killing's sake. Also like Death Race, the reality of the game feels like so much less than that. Your psychopathic killer is a little mass of moody-colored blocks firing orange and yellow dots at other block blobs to make little red dots pour out of them, against a hand-painted background. Ultimately, it is just a cartoon. That was the idea behind titles like Doom and Quake as well, that all the violence within is cartoonish, that you weren't seeing any dynamic not already explored by Tom and Jerry, except now it was a networked competition with rocket launchers. Postal did not sell itself that way. Instead, its developer, Running with Scissors, took advantage of the climate of scrutiny the video games were getting in the wake of Doom's unprecedented impact on pop culture. They made a game that was sure to offend some people, hell, maybe most people, and that was their ticket to success, because for every 4 people who are like, can you believe this shit, the 5th will consider buying it. Controversy profiteering is nothing new in entertainment, but Postal may be the first runaway success to use the advertising tactic in video games. It works perfectly. If you know nothing about computer games, which is the majority of people in 1997, it sounds like a seriously nasty game. But anyone who actually played it is confronted by something else entirely, a game defined not so much by its sharp edges, but by its abiding mediocrity. Sure, this is a game where the people you injure crawl across the ground begging for help, and you have a special button on the keyboard to execute them point blank. But it's also a game that doesn't tell you which key ends the level and then makes fun of you for how long it took you to smash all the keys looking for it. It's a game about pure, unadulterated sadism. It is a game that, despite that foundation of avarice, is somehow an incredible bore. All the best of the game is in the backgrounds. The most distinctive and memorable thing about Postal is how all the violence looks so amazingly at home against the understated, straightforward environments. It's the only really unique thing about Postal. For all the creativity of games, especially at the time, the emphasis was almost always on fantasy worlds, places exotic and new. Postal is about an incredibly drab, worn-out present. Your little psychopath is tired of the world, and as you move through it, there's a distinct artistic impression that the world is tired of itself as well. Of course, that's artistry in spite of their intentions. Running with Scissors is a company very committed to the idea that games are for fun and not to be used for artistic purposes. It's not a trend they kept up, regardless. These handcrafted levels are the last things Running with Scissors ever put out that you might be able to refer to as understated. From this point on, it's going to be all over the top, all the time, especially the gameplay, because here in Postal 1, the mechanics are completely underwhelming and very repetitive. It's what's called an isometric top-down shooter, and it was a PC-only release. You move with the arrows, you pivot with the mouse, and you don't stop until you kill everybody. There's a number of weapons, but the awkwardness of moving and aiming never gets better. Plus, the way that the boundaries of drawn objects in the background are incorporated as 3D objects into the world is inconsistent. You never really can tell where your missiles and grenades are going to get jammed up on the environment. It feels like succeeding in Postal is more about luck than about skill. What you need is nice little clumps of enemies and tight corridors, and you can certainly manipulate your digital victims into these circumstances, but the AI tends to be either incredibly aggressive or completely oblivious. You mostly end up with swarms of angry police and isolated strangers whistling with their hands in their pockets. Each level plays the same, tactically. It's just the backgrounds that shake things up. Sometimes, though, you get a little moment of dark humor that actually works, like the marching band. This level starts you off in a suburban downtown during a parade. The marching band is just coming up. What's a guy with a bandolier of Molotov cocktails and a nasty disposition to do? It's so cartoonish that it is, in fact, pretty funny. A cheap, interactive, ultra-violent knockoff of the climax to Animal House. And it's just pretend, after all. As willfully awful as Postal is, its frivolity of purpose and frivolity of impact are shockingly workable as a foil for everything that goes on in the game. The last level of Postal takes place in an elementary school, and it's here that Running with Scissors actually made a choice that makes the game a somewhat worthwhile exploration of video game violence, and not, the most tasteless thing ever released. Postal 3 gets that honor. Here in the first game, the Postal dude's visit to the elementary school is not interactive or violent. It's a bait-and-switch. After so many levels of carnage and death named simply after what kind of place you're going to be doing the killing in, seeing the elementary school pop up provokes an immediate, visceral response of the player. Nope. That is too fucking far. And then the game agrees with you. The Postal dude cannot hurt the children. He's hallucinating. The end cinematic shows us that the Postal dude is actually in a cell at a mental institution, and this entire game has been a psychotic delusion. And that's really what it is. Postal is an interactive version of the doodles you make in the margins of the newspaper when the person next to you on the bus won't shut up, a gamified version of everything you've ever fantasized about doing to other drivers during rush hour. We all have violent urges, Postal says. Don't be so serious about it. Games are just fantasy. And for all however tasteless Postal is, and it is a whole lot of tasteless, it does have a point and makes it coherently. A digital murder is not equivalent to a real one. It never will be. People who play games know it. The court recognized it when they dismissed Thompson's case. The fundamental legacy of the first game is that in 1997 it was one of the most controversial pieces of software yet released. And as a game, it's hopelessly boring and mundane. Only as an idea did it ever seem dangerous. It was the game that proved the meaningless nature of video game violence by deliberately crossing what people thought was the limit of what could be done and showing that the boundaries lay elsewhere. For Running with Scissors, though, that only meant that they had more work to do. Postal 2 strove to improve on the first game in all ways, and by the metrics and values of the Running with Scissors staff, it did. It is larger, more technically and environmentally complex. It has a much wider array of tactical options. It's more visceral and immediate, a first-person shooter and not a top-down. It has more blood. It has more vomit. It has more piss. It is offensive in many new ways. This time around, in 2003, it would not just push the boundaries of what is acceptable in terms of violence, but also what is acceptable in terms of sexism, racism, and general bullshit. Postal 2 would be a self-styled act of game design rebellion, a proud declaration that they would put whatever they wanted in the game, and anyone who doesn't like it has no sense of humor, and that humorlessness is worse than anything that they actually put in the game. When I was 14, I loved it. I was completely on board with the idea that there was a game so relentlessly dedicated to telling everyone else to go fuck themselves. At 14, that's what I was all about too. I was such a little shit. I was so unbelievably full of myself, and I didn't actually get that being self-righteously miserable isn't really a good look on a person, and blamed the fact that no one wanted to be around me on the fact that everyone else was just a fucking moron. I was going through the most self-centered, ignorant, angry period of my entire life. Postal 2 took every ounce of narcissism and rage I had in my expansively fat, pudgy teenage body and told me that I was not only justified in feeling that way, but super cool for doing so. By the time junior year of high school rolled around, I was still awkward as hell, but I'd figured out that being enthusiastic is more endearing than being a jackass, especially when you have zero life experience to actually back up your cynicism. I never went back to Postal 2, until now, at 27, when I wanted to cover the series. Playing the game this time around was a complicated experience. I was not only reliving the game, I was reliving my mindset as a teenage dirtbag. At that age, I thought everything was shit, everyone was stupid, and only I knew what was really going on. It's cringe-inducing to look back on. Postal 2 isn't just looking back at that attitude, it is reloading a save state of that attitude. It's frustrating because Postal 2 does have some things that make it unique amongst games, and has one or two interesting things to say about the expression of morality in games. Actually playing it, however, is akin to the experience of a man pooping on your desk while winking, and if you get mad at him, the guy stops and says, "Hey, buddy, can't you take a joke? What kind of moron doesn't think poop on the desk is funny?" Postal 1 was a murder simulator. It rode the wave of controversy surrounding violence to success. Postal 2 has a much wider mandate. It's an asshole simulator, through and through. Postal 2's major conceit, the thing that makes it enduringly famous, is that you don't have to play it violently at all. There are, technically, peaceful solutions to everything. You just have to allow yourself to be inconvenienced, aggravated, and victimized. The way the game is arranged is pretty unique. You play through 5 days, each with 3 or 4 chores and errands that you have to accomplish. Most are mundane, like get milk or cash paycheck, and some are outrageous, like piss on Dad's grave. Each chore is spread out across the open-world map of Paradise, Arizona. There's a dozen or two large, meandering areas, many urban, some outdoor, that comprise what really does feel like a weird little desert town. There are many houses and many businesses, almost all of which you can go inside, explore, and commit felonies in. Like Grand Theft Auto, the open-world, crime-driven approach is compelling. In creating an open world, the developers wanted it to be truly open. Do whatever you want, however you like. The way the game is segmented into days with a free-form approach to tasks contributes to that open-world sensation. The idea that you have a choice about morality contributes to the open-world sensation, but both are much more sensation than reality. Yes, you have an open world, but you are essentially limited to chores, theft, and violence in terms of interacting with it, and it unlocks slowly. Yes, you can play the game without killing anyone, if you're willing to put up with a staggering amount of bullshit and colossally waste your time. The good path is one that is continually attempting to provoke you to violence. Getting milk properly involves, just like real life, standing in a 5-minute line and then paying. You're insulted the entire time. Returning a library book prompts a violent interruption from book-burning fanatics. Other tasks will get you kidnapped by rednecks who put you in a gimp suit. To escape, you can run and try to make it past dozens and dozens and dozens of armed rednecks, but you probably won't make it. If you're committed to nonviolence, though, you'll just have to make it. There is a moral to the story of being moral in Postal 2. Patience is for suckers. You would have taken less time and had more fun if you had just been bad. Every mechanic in the game is oriented towards you being a psychopathic murderer, not a law-abiding citizen, including the Postal Dude's voice work. Even if you act nicely, he is still a complete jackass in conversations and complains about the player being too much of a goody two-shoes if you are. The good path, if you try to pursue it, is at the very extreme of basic playability. So, sure, you have a choice if you want to be good or evil, but if you don't want to act maliciously, you might as well not play the game at all. It's not for you. It has a very specific vision of who it is for. If you try to play it differently, the game treats you like a complete sucker. What kind of moron would have empathy for video game characters? In the first game, the Postal Dude was crazy. The entire game was a schizophrenic break with reality. Postal 2 has no such frame. I mean, it doesn't have any elementary schools either, but the tone shift between the first and second game is huge. Postal Dude here is a henpecked and bitter everyman type. The idea is that he has a shitty life with a shitty wife in a shitty town, and that is good enough to justify killing whoever he pleases. It is, in the broadest possible sense, a satire. Everything about Paradise is obnoxious, petty, and hateful. Every character is self-centered, vapid, and hypocritical. Every advertisement is gross, decadent, and nasty. By making a world that is a funhouse mere reflection of everything infuriating about everyday suburban life in 2003, the dude's homicidal overreactions seem pretty in keeping with the universe at large. No one could care less if you live or die. You are simply reflecting that nihilistic apathy right back. Right? Well, it isn't actually much of a nihilism. The Postal Dude doesn't believe in nothing. He is a strong believer in himself. Rick Hunter's voice work for the game is relentlessly, gratingly smug. The single unifying emotion behind every line of dialogue the Postal Dude has is bemused dislike. One-liners in action games are pretty ubiquitous, especially back in the day, and while self-satisfaction is the basis of even most good one-liners, Postal 2 really kicks the narcissism up a notch. The game itself has a fiercely navel-gazing quality, in fact. One of the first tasks, picking up your paycheck, involves going to the Running with Scissors office, the real developer, and meeting Vince Desiderio, the real CEO, and others who have digital versions of themselves and voice themselves in the game. Then the office is attacked by people protesting how violent their video games are. You see, in this carefully constructed fantasy world, everyone who's said negative things about Running with Scissors is a hypocrite, and a moron, and a stain on the floor once the Postal Dude is done with them. It's the perfect out. It's not them killing their critics, it's just a situation that encourages the player to do it, or else ineffectually run away. It was the player's choice to kill these people. Running with Scissors is in no way responsible for what the player does, and besides, can't you take a joke? Postal 2 portrays every group that way, corrupt, stupid, and needing a good massacre. It's a peculiar combination of LOL so random nonsense thrown together with a healthy dose of South Park-influenced hatred of anyone who dares to take something, anything, seriously. As a 14-year-old, this made sense. I was mad at the world, and it felt like everyone was a two-faced shitheel. Except me, of course. I liked quote-unquote offensive humor. I thought it was funny. If anyone around me objected, tried to get me to understand that I was being an asshole, that I was saying racist, sexist things, then that person was suspect. I knew at 14 what the world was all about. It was all about misery and shit. People asking me to be nicer obviously just had some kind of self-serving mystery motive. It was not the violence that spoke to me when I was 14 when it came to Postal 2. I didn't relate to it because I wanted to kill other people. I related to it because it was a whole world in which I would never be expected to apologize for anything. At 14, this was the way of the world to me. Politically incorrect was awesome. You just say what you like and other people just have to fucking deal with it, right? So I could play a game like Postal 2 and feel like there was nothing truly offensive about it. It was just jokes. But consider for a moment, could anyone who wasn't what the industry considered its default audience make these jokes and star in this game? Suppose, for instance, that you had a black protagonist. Do you honestly think that a developer could make a game about an African-American man taking bloody revenge against his entire community for perceived slights and petty bullshit? To include gameplay that involves him going up to a convenience store clerk saying, "Guess you thought you weren't gonna die today. Surprise!" and then decapitating him with a shotgun? What if the Postal Dude was Muslim and blowing up people? What if he was a woman and it was a shitty husband at home that drove her to homicidal rage? Postal 2 claims to be a game committed to freedom of expression, the idea that words and images can never hurt people and therefore should never be limited. Yet it's predicated on the idea that other people behaving shittily towards you is pretty much worth shooting up the town over. In the Postal Dude, you have a character whose every whim is more important than the lives of any other character in the game. It's an escapist power fantasy, but it's an escapist power fantasy made exclusively for people who look and think pretty much just like the Postal Dude. If you take someone from a marginalized background and allow them the same digital violence, the same narcissistic fantasies, then Postal 2's antisocial premise loses its politically incorrect pretense and becomes flatly political. In the regular game, the Postal Dude has to deal with some idiot foreigner who's probably a terrorist to get milk, and so he ends up killing everyone with a shovel. That's good old-fashioned apolitical humor, right? In a hypothetical version of this game, a Muslim Postal Dude goes into a convenience store and has to deal with some idiot white guy who's probably a member of the KKK to get milk, so he ends up killing everyone with a shovel. Is that still apolitical? All in good fun? Or does it suddenly become, hey, whoa, not all white guys, why so violent and hateful? It's very easy to say that these games are meant to be offensive, so why be offended by all the shitty jabs and racist memes? When a person says, I didn't think it was all that offensive, especially about Postal 2, there is a good chance that you were not the butt of the majority of these jokes. Flip the tables, make it so that the butts of the game jokes are the punchline makers, and you'll see pretty goddamn quick that a developer could never, ever get away with releasing a game like this if it wasn't already from what the market assumed is the default player perspective in 2003. White, male, and real mad about stuff. There is no consequence for expressing this kind of jaded, violent malaise that Postal 2 does if you're, as they're trying to portray the protagonist, just a dude. There are huge consequences for expressing the same resentment and rage if you're considered an outsider. At 14, I thought I was an outsider. I wasn't. It does not get much more inside than having your most depraved, violent fantasies sold to you as a retail product. The thing that shifted my perspective the most from when I was 14 and thought Postal 2 was hilarious, and now, happened when I was 19, and something happened to me that could have been lifted straight out of the game like Postal 2. It was also the only time in my life that I actually strongly felt like killing another person. First car I ever bought was a 1978 Lincoln Continental. Beautiful, elegant, enormous machine. I drove it on a 5,000-mile, 2-week road trip from San Diego to Boston. It was the most prized possession of my entire life up to that point. And, long story short, it gets stolen. At 5 a.m., I get a call. "Oh, this is the Escondido Police Department. Is this Noah? We found your car." So I breathe a sigh of relief, and then he continues. "I'm sorry, but by the time officers arrived on the scene, your vehicle was completely engulfed in flames." Like, not just a little engulfed in flames, not something that would buff out, but completely fucking engulfed in flames. It doesn't really get much more final than that. So I have to go to the impound lot that they towed its carcass to, and that's when things get way worse. They demand proof of ownership for the car, and they would charge me $280 a day in fees until I provide the proof and pay them the full amount I owe them. Over $800 by their count for the tow and a single day's storage. For having my car stolen. I explained that all the paperwork was in the glove box of the Lincoln, and then the woman, this awful woman, whose awful face is seared into my memory for all time, looks at me, smacks her chewing gum, and says, "That's gonna be a pretty big problem for you, 'cause that thing's a crispy critter." Took me a minute to process what she had said, that she had just added a literal insult to injury, and when I had processed it, it was obvious. She was gonna have to die. She would have to. There would be no other fucking way. And that's when I realized that impound lots don't have bulletproof glass because of robberies. They have it because of what they do to people, and how angry it makes those people in turn. If that bulletproof glass hadn't been there, I would have done something I regretted, probably involving her face and a nearby stapler. Ultimately, I had to spend 4 hours on the phone with the impound lot's corporate office, who eventually told me what papers to get from the DMV to transfer ownership of the carcass to them, and for this, I would only be charged $300. It was, the man said, very generous. I called the cop who took my statement. He said that if I had had better insurance, the insurance would have paid, but what happened to me was totally legal except for the initial theft. On their end, they had no leads and would not be spending time looking into the matter. It was a powerful and savage education. The world really doesn't care. The more vulnerable you are, the harder you get hit. I never really knew that until I was vulnerable myself, living in a shitty neighborhood with the cheapest possible car insurance. Here's the lesson I learned. There are people in the world suffering injustices both small and large that I could never even begin to guess at. So maybe I should stop talking so much shit and stop being so skeptical of other people's struggles. The whole experience shocked me into seeing outside myself, how I had been preyed on not because of who I was, but because I was positioned in the system in a way that made me open to that kind of predation. It wasn't lost on me that stealing a car, joyriding around all night, and then setting it on fire was something I had done over and over and over again in games. Except now it had really happened to me, and I learned that little joy comes out of a joyride. There's actually an academic phrase for the kind of behavior patterns that lead a fella to steal another man's car and set it on fire, and that phrase is toxic masculinity. By just saying those two words in combination, I've probably caused a chain reaction of shitty YouTube comments pages long, but by and large, the people who say that toxic masculinity is make-believe just do not understand the phrase. Toxic masculinity does not say that masculine expression is inherently toxic. It's not a way of saying guys are bad and guy stuff, evil. Toxic masculinity is a concept that can be applied directly to situations like what happened to me in my old doomed Lincoln. I would never have bought a Lincoln Continental if I wasn't myself exploring my masculinity. I was learning car repair from a friend of mine, I was driving a 20-foot-long symbol of traditional authority, I was having a fantastic time, and it was all constructive, all fun, and meaningful ways to engage with my masculinity and figure out what it means to be a man in the 21st century. The guy who stole my car, he was also expressing his masculinity. For that night, he was the cool one. A beautiful stolen car, an open city, ripe for the taking, and when he grew tired of the evening, all it took was a rag down the gas tank to blow it all up. So who's the bigger man? The sucker who played by the rules, bought the car and fixed it, or the renegade who wouldn't play by anyone's rules, who steals and burns for pleasure? Is the man who turns the wrench, or the man who lights the match, who is worthy of admiration? Isn't that exactly the sort of decision Postal 2 asks the player to make? I know very well how much fun it probably was to do to my car what he did. I have done the same thing in the aptly titled Grand Theft Auto series. I have seen the two paths of Postal 2 writ large on top of an invoice for my burnt-up car. Even if the guy who did in my car is in prison by now, which I honestly do not think is particularly likely, he has a story he can tell for the rest of his life that makes him look like a super badass. I had to clean up after him. I had to suffer the injury and, through the impound lot, pay for the consequences. His expression of masculinity was completely self-centered, destructive, and shitty. He fucked with my life to feel better about his own. This is toxic masculinity. Frequently, I see repeated that toxic masculinity was made up by feminists to make men feel bad for being men, but y'all can go tell that to someone who never had their car stolen and set on fire for someone else's kicks. It isn't even the most recent time a vehicle of mine has been vandalized, just the most dramatic. Postal 2 is a game that not only simulates the attitude of the guy who stole my car, the attitude I had as a shitty teenager, the fuck everyone, I'm gonna get mine attitude. It is a game that lionizes and celebrates it. It is a game that is absolutely delighted by the most nasty, self-centered ways to be manly. As a digital expression, all crimes therein are victimless, for fun. I'm not saying Postal 2 makes people murderers and car thieves in real life. I am saying that it's a game that pats you on the back and gives you a huge thumb up for being the biggest jackass you can possibly be, bigger than you could ever be in real life. That is the principal fantasy of Postal 2. Not a fantasy of violence, or even a fantasy of racism or misogyny in a targeted way. It is the fantasy of being a dick to everyone and always getting away with it. It's a weird kind of fun to come back to after having actually lived in the world for a bit. It's a weird kind of humor, too. To say it hasn't aged well is a profound understatement. Every joke fits into one of three categories: gross-out body humor, stereotypical caricature, and zany random nonsense. Zany is how it sees itself, anyway. As time goes on, I find myself less and less able to appreciate, oh my god, how random humor. I know 14-year-old me thought it was just a crack-up. A shotgun silencer. That's just a cat with your gun up its butt? An action figure hero. That's a ball sack? Gary Coleman. With an assault rifle? The repetitive mission structure always presents the joke to you that way as well. Mundane activity. With a stupid, violent twist? I half expected a mission about how bad are airline peanuts, but I don't think the game would have actually gotten past the nuts part without fixating on it. Then there's the way it uses racist and sexist stereotypes straight, without any sense of irony. Not that the irony would mitigate it, but that's not even a pretense in the game. Asians eat dogs. Ha ha. All Middle Easterners are secretly terrorists. Ha ha. All women are fat harpies or hot bitches. Ha ha. This is the part when folks say, but Postal 2 is a satire. It's satirizing these attitudes. And I ask, how? Where is the satire in direct mimetic representation? The dumb stereotype is that Asians eat dogs and talk funny. How is this satirized by making every Asian in your game eat dogs and talk funny? South Park and Family Guy often go into this territory and struggle with it as well. Like, can we all agree that Mort is the absolute worst character on Family Guy and that there's nothing particularly satirical about him either? South Park has more success, usually. Remember the Richers episode where they used racist stereotypes but applied them to rich people instead? Where they burn a cross on a mansion's front lawn and the family in the house are like, it's a T for time to leave? In that case, the show took stereotypes and racist behavior and recontextualized them in a way that highlights the idiocy and ridiculousness of the behavior, which is satire. Let's take a gamer stereotype. All gamers are fat male virgins in their parents' basement, for example. Is it satire if, in a movie, every gamer is a fat male virgin in their parents' basement with no further commentary? Or is that just an annoying repetition of a judgmental meme? You need one extra layer of commentary beyond just mindlessly repeating shitty things for it to actually qualify as satire. I don't even have to argue if these jokes are sexist and racist, since being deliberately offensive, being racist and sexist to provoke a reaction, was the authorial intent of the game. So, sure, you can take all the racism, sexism, and shittiness in the game and go, it's just jokes. Can't you take a joke? But having the intention of being a joke isn't a guarantee that the joke will actually work. These are half-baked, half-assed attempts at humor that only have a passing familiarity with how to set up a joke besides regular thing with a weird, gross thing? The most frustrating thing about criticizing games for their political content is that some players who enjoyed the content will feel criticized by proxy and get incredibly upset about it. This is really silly and really misguided. Enjoying Postal 2 does not mean that the players are racist or sexist because they had fun with it. It doesn't mean the developers are doing anything other than talking shit on an individual level. But Postal 2, the game, is overwhelmingly defined by its love of offensive, politically incorrect humor, which translates to being shitty about everyone who is not the Postal dude or someone exactly like him. I don't think Postal 2 works as comedy for just those reasons. It postures itself like outsider art, but it's all a jumble of stereotypes and toilet humor filtered through the Unreal Engine. There are moments where it's an alright game despite all this. There are reasons to enjoy Postal 2. Gameplay reasons. There just isn't another game interested in simulating a small Arizona town in as much detail as Postal 2 does. And the sun-bleached banality of Paradise is a fantastic backdrop for eruptions of spiteful violence. The way the AI operates, and being able to pit dogs, cats, police, pedestrians, and everyone else against each other, is great fun. The way you can pour gasoline in long trails and then ignite it is a pretty brilliant implementation, especially for 2003. The gunplay, though, is generally pretty bad, unevenly paced and lacking any sense of impact, but the variety of weapons is pretty impressive. You don't lack for ways to murder folks, and exploring your options in that arena is a lot of the actual experience of the game. Like the first game, playing as a psychopath does not directly translate into psychopathy in the player. Racism and sexism in the game don't directly translate to racism and sexism in the player. Postal the First is deliberately provocative and shows that video game violence is inherently frivolous. It's just pictures and words. When it comes to violence, it's an obvious distinction. The thing is, though, when it comes to racism and sexism, pictures and words can be themselves acts of racism and sexism, one of the ways that they actually cause damage in real life. A digital murder is victimless. No one was murdered. A joke about how women are either hot sluts or fat bitches in a video game is still a sexist joke, whether it's digital or not. It's mean-spirited bullshit, and being in a game as a joke does not mitigate the fact that it is, in fact, mean-spirited bullshit. Of course, you can say, who gives a shit if it's mean, but the answer to that question is pretty much always someone who has to put up with this kind of bullshit when they are not just playing a game. Could you imagine playing Postal 2 if you were actually from the Middle East? How insulting it would be? How it would compound with all the other dumb stereotypical humor about Middle Easterners? It's not just, can't you take a joke? It's, how about you listen to one more joke about how dumb you are? Perhaps you've even heard it before. It's easy to say, but it's fun, the gameplay is fun, so I don't care if it's shitty to people, it's still a good game. Luckily, there is an immediate example of how thin a line Postal 2 walks between a deeply flawed but unique game experience and total bullshit. It's a line that gets totally obliterated by Apocalypse Weekend, a linear expansion pack for Postal 2. The climax of Postal 2 sees the apocalypse happen because, LOL, so random, and as cats fall from the sky and everyone kills each other in a town-wide bloodbath, the Postal dude returns to his trailer where his wife complains, because complaining is literally all she does, that the Postal dude forgot the ice cream she asked for on day one. Then a gunshot. Did the Postal dude finally kill his wife, or kill himself, rather than listen to her for one more minute? It's the latter, of course. He doesn't do a good job of it, and wakes up later in the hospital on Saturday, after a long dream about how cool he is. It's still the apocalypse, but the first thing you do is wander the hallways looking for a room to masturbate in, for money, for the hospital's sperm donation program. This time around, the game seems to be saying, we will be as gross as we want to be, which is more than before. The idea that there should be any baseline of normality gets tossed out the window. In Apocalypse Weekend, nothing would stand in the way of running with scissors' joke-telling prowess. Not the idea of being able to solve quests two ways, not the open-world design concept, and certainly not the ability to solve tasks in any order. No, what Postal 2 needed to be, according to Apocalypse Weekend, was a corridor shooter with 3,000% more dick jokes than the average corridor shooter. The hospital itself feels like it takes absolutely forever. Bland sanitary corridors interspersed with hallucinations. The head wound is an opportunity to reintroduce proper schizophrenic psychopathy into the game. So throughout Apocalypse Weekend, you play sections that are bizarre and dreamlike. They're populated by evil Gary Coleman clones, just in case you thought the game was in danger of being serious for a moment. In the hospital levels, just about all you have to fight them with are scissors and grenades. It is spectacularly annoying combat, and it just goes on and on and on. You do the upper floors of the hospital, the lower floors of the hospital, the industrial areas underneath the hospital, and then back up again. Apocalypse Weekend squeezes the most playtime from its maps as possible by having you run through forwards and then backwards, like in the Terror's training camp, or even twice through straight, like the rival game developer office. When you first get out of the hospital, the game almost fools you into thinking it was open world like the main campaign, but it isn't. You just have this little town square with a movie theater, a couple alleyways, and a restaurant. This is when the zombies attack. This is how they get around the problem of maintaining a peaceful playthrough while turning the game into a linear corridor shooter. Have the player shoot zombies and Gary Coleman hallucinations instead of killing regular folks. Most of the new combat does not count against your peaceful score. It's a cheap way out of honoring the idea that the game actually gives you a choice. But what's more is that the farther away Postal gets from its straightforward, mundane environments and surroundings, the less that the jokes even function, the more pointless the whole game seems. Running with Scissors, who seem to have a pretty clear idea about how important a baseline of normality was to Postal 1 and Postal 2, seem to feel here that wherever their imaginations took them was not only good enough, but genius, regardless of if it's completely disconnected from the rhythms of the main game. You can even ask them yourself. Running with Scissors is in the game again, in an even bigger role, and will tell you quite explicitly that they are the coolest, most badass, most all-around awesome dev team that ever dev-teamed a game project. About 1/4 of Apocalypse Weekend is spent making fun, if you can even really call it that, of other game developers. Your main task on Saturday, besides executing cows and killing zombies who are preventing you from getting lunch, is to get the Postal 2 Gold Master CD back from a rival game developer who stole it, because Postal 2 is just that much of an innovative and brilliant product. Later on, you plant a nuclear bomb in the developer's office that eventually destroys the whole town at the climax. Your reward for getting the disc back is to, quote, party with the Postal babes at my place being the in-game mansion of Vince Desiderio, CEO of Running with Scissors. Sunday morning is defending Vince's mansion from zombie attacks. I have never seen any other game where a developer put themselves inside it this much, so ham-fistedly. There's even a weird joke about how there's a pigeon hunting level with super amazing graphics and then a live clip of Vince Desiderio where he pretends to be real mad about not having enough money to make the level, talking on 2 phones at once and throwing them around and such. Desi's anger is a badly acted skit, like literally right here in this moment. It comes across as so egotistical, which they're theoretically playing up for laughs in this instance, but it's not as endearing as they think it is. Postal 2, and Apocalypse Weekend even more so, is smug. It's smug about being offensive, smug about how getting offended by how in-your-face extreme it is somehow reflects poorly on you, smug about how the game is somehow so much better than other more ambitiously designed first-person shooters. The idea that Running with Scissors' egotism is a joke kinda falls apart under the weight of how absolutely self-satisfied the game design of Postal 2 is as a whole. I never played Apocalypse Weekend when I was younger. This was my first time with it, and by the end I was absolutely desperate for it to finally be over. The blandness and linearity of the level design in Apocalypse Weekend is mind-numbing, especially coupled with the nonsense dialogue and the mountain of capital-letter ridiculous crap the expansion throws at you. We know you're eager to go where you thought you were going to go, but first, how about 20 minutes of killing elephants with a scythe? How about 45 minutes of fighting soldiers and ululating Taliban in decorationless industrial corridors? How about watching yourself play this game and thinking about how your real life, is slipping through your fingers moment by moment while this bullshit game seeps in through your eyeballs? Like Postal 2 with Apocalypse Weekend shows that the only thing that is actually edgy, the only thing that seems dangerous, is the context of these games. All this angry jackass humor, all the gallons of blood and urine, it only seems like an act of malevolence if you don't actually play the game, if you let it be a dangerous idea. In practice, it is too deliberately pointless and sophomorically inept to ever really be dangerous. As awful as the game's humor is to everyone who isn't the Postal dude, it was never a powerful force in gaming culture. It's the loud, angry vanity project of a very opinionated guy and his friends. Running with Scissors banks on the sharp edges of their self-image, how abrasive the game is, how abrasive Desiderio is in press releases and forum posts. Postal 2 banks on the fact that there are people like me who will think that the game is complete bullshit and will want to talk about why it's complete bullshit. Then it can set itself up as the brave game that does what it likes, no matter what those politically correct morons say. It works well, unless you actually play the damn game. Then you'll see not only the good ideas of the design being overshadowed by its cultural posturing, but see the egotism of that posturing completely overwhelm the parts of the game that were actually working here in the expansion. Even the climax is self-referential. The boss is a demonic version of Running with Scissors programmer Mike J. Then a quick cinematic of the Postal Dude and his dog Champ escaping from paradise as the nuclear bomb detonates. The Postal Dude declares, "I regret nothing." It's become something of a slogan for Vince Desi and Running with Scissors. But it's not exactly wholly truthful either. They all seem to regret Postal 3 quite deeply. Running with Scissors isn't actually responsible for the third game. Not wholly responsible, anyway. It was assembled by a Russian developer, Trashmasters, and a Russian producer, Akela. They had previously produced a licensed Russian-only expansion to Postal 2. Postal 3 was released in the US in December of 2011. By August of 2012, Running with Scissors was no longer stocking the game on their website and was actively discouraging franchise fans from buying it. Postal 3 is something kind of amazing. A game that is such a flop that it was disowned by the franchise creator. A bad game in all ways. Broken as a piece of software, incomprehensible as an attempt at comedy, infuriating as interactive entertainment. Postal 3 is terrible. I once said Duke Nukem Forever was the worst game ever. I was wrong. I had not played Postal 3. There is no single consumer product available on Steam so thoroughly devoid of merit or meaning as this fucking game. I hated every single solitary second of it. So I did something I haven't done since I was a teenager either. I played through with God Mode on. It's the closest thing that a gamer has to a fast-forward switch at their disposal. Consider. The second level has you collecting HIV-infected cats, but then you have to defend yourself from an endlessly spawning army of Mexican sushi cooks who are all wearing conical hats. They are mad because they need the cat meat, and you're competing with them for these cats. The melee combat is broken, hit detection is as schizophrenically undependable as the script, there are very few firearms in the level. So you have to wade through an infinite army of confusingly racist caricatures while collecting cats and swinging wildly with a machete. I died twice on this level before thinking, if I don't do this game, one and done, straight through, I will never finish it. I had no desire to do a single thing in this game more than once, really, even once. I want to be clear about this. Fuck this game. If you don't think that's given the game a fair shake, I do not care. According to Steam achievements, only 12% of players have bothered to finish it. I am hardly alone in my bottomless dislike of this game. So, how is it that this game even came to pass? It had, by Running with Scissors' own aggravated admission, a considerably larger budget than Postal 2. The game's loading screen suggests that the developer's drug habits took up a considerable chunk of budget. Sure, they mean that as a joke, but I have no alternative explanation for this game besides methamphetamines and gross incompetence. It jabbers on and on endlessly with a vapid, fragmented intensity. And as far as the franchise goes, they undoubtedly made a serious meth of it. It's not like this game doesn't let you know how things are going to be. Your very first non-tutorial level, your job is to use a shop vacuum to suck up semen-filled rags in a porn shop run by Ron Jeremy. Yes, the old and grody Ron Jeremy. And then use your reserve of jizz rags to drive out a group of soccer mom protesters who break into the porn shop. You have to balance your time between pelting the protesters with semen, while the Postal Dude makes comments like, "Come on, your husband would approve," and then running upstairs to hoover up more dirty Kleenex. Pelt a woman with enough stale semen, she vomits and runs from the store. Do that to all the women, you win. This is the first level. Level 1, the Tone Setter, and its gamified sexual assault played for laughs. Like the last game, Postal 3 winkingly asks, "Oh no, have we gone too far for your delicate sensibilities, you pansy?" It is shitty in ways that Postal 2 did not even reach for, but it is so frustrating as a mechanical experience that its offensive bullshit is less central to how the game comes across. A player's anger at the game bleeds together, it becomes an indistinct background static as you play. Each level is exactly the same. You receive a menial task, partially accomplish the menial task, and then get interrupted by something chosen at random from an index of South Park reruns. How about, say, Osama bin Laden asks you to deliver Happy Meal toys, which are actually explosives, which are in the shape of ball sacks, to the mall, but are interrupted by gay cowboys riding Segways with pistols. This is a level in the game. Or, oh, suppose you have to go to, maybe Mexico and shoot footballs full of drugs across the border, okay, and then get in a shootout with DEA agents. That's a level in the game, too. Or, let's see, we'll reuse Ron Jeremy and have him be mayor because whatever the fuck, and you have to escort his Malaysian bondage slave out of town hall without being seen by paparazzi. That's also a level in the game. There are, in fact, 17 levels in an evil playthrough, 19 levels in a good one. Not a single one makes any more sense than any of the setups I've described. It is not random humor, it's beyond that. It's like having a stroke while reading Mad Magazine. Words and ideas in a nonsensical brain-damaged heap, with only a vague sensation that these things are somehow supposed to be funny to someone somewhere. And who knows, maybe someone out there actually likes Postal 3. It's hard to imagine. Each of the 17 levels I played had the same repetitive setup, and while many words and long cutscenes are used to string the levels together, it never once comes close to making any kind of sense. It is easy to find Postal 2 offensive. The game is doing it deliberately. I'm not fully convinced that Postal 3 has the wherewithal to actually truly know if it's being offensive or not. I know that it is trying very hard to be. It is also trying very hard to be a third-person shooter. I don't think that it knows how to accomplish either. In the court of public opinion, it is entirely possible that Postal 3 is not competent to stand trial. By far the weirdest thing about the game is that it would prefer it if you played the good path, the non-violent path, the path of infinite inconvenience. A considerable amount of programming time went into it. There are, in fact, 3 endings. And the bad ending, which you get for solving the majority of missions in the game with violence, involves the dude being sentenced to the electric chair and going to hell. The whole mission structure, actually, is part of a narrative frame where the postal dude is justifying his actions to St. Peter at the gates of heaven. St. Peter has a big old lisp, and the game makes a ton of gay jokes about him before it's revealed that he is St. Peter. Is this also a joke? I don't know. If you're neutral, with a mix of violence and non-violence, the postal dude wins the lottery, writes a bestseller, and marries someone named Jennifer Walcott, who plays herself in the game despite being entirely unrecognizable. She's referred to as one of the Postal Babes, a squad of models who works for Running with Scissors. The game makes it clear that being married to her will be different from the postal dude's previous marriage because she is a cool girl in small pants who hits protesters on the head with a shovel, just like the postal dude. And bitter psychopaths who wear leather trench coats in the Arizona heat are just her type. She's also the post-game prize for the completely non-violent playthrough in which Walcott is First Lady and the postal dude is President of the United States. If you play the bad end, the game will tell you that the other endings are better and that you should have played the game differently. This is a postal game. This postal game, in between telling me to pelt women with jizz rags and vacuum up poop while dressed as a giant cock and balls, is telling me that I should pursue a path of non-violence. Of course, all your tools of non-violence are awful and broken. Your taser run out of batteries while you're under a hail of machine gun fire? Better reload that level, buddy. More Postal 3 for you. At about level 4 in the game, you have to choose between helping the police or helping a Scientologist eco-terrorist hybrid group, ingeniously called the Ecotologists. This is the part where you choose a path of good or evil. Whichever group you help, you become a member of. If you're a cop, you're expected to make arrests, not kills. Do you know what to make of this? Why this is even in a postal game? I don't either. This is a series whose mechanics are completely founded on homicidal rampage. It is the franchise's reason for being. Postal 2's morality was much more of a gimmick than a full-fledged game mode. Fully half, maybe a little more than half, of Postal 3's content is devoted to a good path, which is still as schizophrenically offensive to both sensibility and playability as the Evil campaign, except you don't get to take out your frustrations within the game, because you are an officer of the law. That, to me, is the biggest mystery of Postal 3. I had no desire to play nicely for 1 second. I went evil all the way, killing everyone I met. But the Evil campaign is still principally defined by busy work, sometimes bloody, usually not. One level has you killing terrorists, but first you have to harvest apples with a vacuum, or pick up rhinoceros poop with a vacuum. It is outrageous that so many levels have you using a shop vac as your primary means of completing objectives. It would stand out in any other game, but here it is one of the lesser of incompetent design choices. The segues are a bigger one, and having the game joke about how Postal 3 has vehicle combat now, is not so much smarmy as infuriating. The biggest problem is the linear design. While there are a couple of town maps, there is no normality, no point in exploring the towns. They're just cardboard backgrounds to whatever the game decides to throw at you. That includes not one, but 2 escort missions, which tell you, in the mission description, that the AI in the game is terrible, so watch for that when you're doing the escorting. The terrible design choices and broken implementations of what features there are get played off as a hilarious goof on the player, like the player is participating in a fun little joke by playing so thoroughly miserable a game. It's not like that can't work. I did enjoy Goat Simulator. But here in Postal 3, it's a dodge, worse, an extra kick in the face to players who were expecting a playable game. This is why Running with Scissors does not stock Postal 3 and tells franchise fans not to buy it. Postal 3 was at long last offensive to the one group Running with Scissors could never actually be offensive towards: longtime fans. It's not the script or the jokes that made them disown the game. I saw a forum post on NeoGAF by Mike J., the fellow whose demonic likeness is the Apocalypse Weekend boss, saying that the voice work and dialogue were on point for what they wanted for Postal 3. It was the fact that Akella and Trashmasters had deviated from the game design that Running with Scissors asked for, from the rhythms and methods of play that had endeared their player base to Postal 2 that was the problem. All of the non-violent stuff was supposed to be a sideshow. Instead, huge portions of the game are dedicated to systems of interaction that are totally counter to the open-world mayhem of the previous game. There had obviously been, at one point, some kind of ambition towards an open world, the larger town maps definitely suggested, but nothing interesting was ever done with those maps. And perhaps the biggest offense of all, Running with Scissors wasn't making any money from it. To this day, Akella keeps the profits for Postal 3. It's why Running with Scissors wanted it taken off Steam, but Akella said no, and it's Akella's game now, and their call. Meanwhile, Postal 1 and 2 were on Steam as well, and enjoying a whole new audience and newfound popularity through digital distribution. Running with Scissors had not financially recovered enough from Postal 3 to make a proper Postal 4, but Steam sales were making them enough to go back to their iconic title. They would release an expansion DLC for Postal 2, 12 years after the game came out. For Running with Scissors, it would be like no time had passed at all. Paradise Lost explicitly picks up right where Running with Scissors left off with Apocalypse Weekend. It has the same town, the same mechanics, the same graphics engine, the same sense of humor. It is as if Postal 3 never happened, which the game makes abundantly clear in the first 60 seconds. It apparently did not. The intro to Paradise Lost explains that the Postal Dude was run off the road by the nuclear blast at the end of Apocalypse Weekend and slipped into a 12-year coma during which Postal 3 was a dream that he had. Postal 3 is such a bad game, so disliked by Running with Scissors, that it is literally the first thing that Paradise Lost wants to get straight on. This would be a true return to paradise, a giant DLC as long as Postal 2 itself, with brand new jokes and a new post-apocalyptic look. There's just one problem. From a design standpoint, it is not all new. It is almost the exact same game as Postal 2. Almost every map from the main game is completely reused, flatly reused, with a new coat of paint that actually detracts considerably from what charm there was to the level design of the first game. There, in the base, it was a normal little town full of dislikable, shitty people, and the eruptions of violence were a reaction to and a disruption of that normalcy. The games played the straight man, setting up the joke, and the player would make their own punchline. That was the key element to Postal 2's successful humor, what little successful humor there was in the game. Paradise Lost is the same physical map. I mean, sure, they futz around with the level transitions a little, but it is overwhelmingly the same as Postal 2, but everything is altered to be post-apocalyptic and grungy. It takes a somewhat naturalistic, run-down little town and turns it into an extremely generic video game environment. Zombies, demons, gangs, survivalists, everything either self-consciously gritty or unapologetically nonsensical. Couple this with the fact that humor in Paradise Lost is much more Apocalypse Weekend than the base game. Whatever they come up with, whatever random shit, and it is both random and shit, just goes in the game, and that's good enough. The mission structure is almost exactly the same, but instead of getting all your chores assigned to you by your wife, each day has a different faction boss. The first day is just the Postal Dude, but the second day is Vince Desi and the Running with Scissors staff, back again to assure you that they are all cool dudes and very wealthy. Then Mike J. the Demon on the third day, Gary Coleman and his army of underground midgets the fourth day, and finally the Taliban, who now wear tie-dye, on the fifth day. The chores that each faction assigns you are reflective of the faction, sabotaging rival game developers for Running with Scissors, getting bomb components for the Taliban, etc. Success will reunite the Postal Dude with his dog Champ, for the third time in the franchise. Failure will result in you having to play more Paradise Lost. The achievement you get for beating the expansion is called Better Than Postal 3. Is it? I mean, the short answer is yes. Having your game system catch fire and melt into a puddle is better than Postal 3. Being better than Postal 3 is the world's lowest bar. Paradise Lost does clear it. But is Paradise Lost significantly different from Postal 3 in terms of intent and presentation? In that case, the answer is no. If you're going off script alone, Paradise Lost is equally as bad as Postal 3. They even incorporate the voice actor who did the Postal Dude in Postal 3 as his own character, first as a voice in the original Postal Dude's head, and then as a hallucination in cutscenes. The difference between Postal 3 and Paradise Lost, however, is a difference in potential. I'm open to the idea that Trash Masters had never scripted a video game before in their lives and completely fell on their face with it. Running with Scissors, though, has had 12 years to grow and improve comedically and technically. They have had 12 years to think about what works and what doesn't in what is their only truly successful product. It's not a matter of budget, either. The simple fact is that 2003's Postal 2 is still, in 2015, Running with Scissors' flagship title, their iconic work, their bestseller. Paradise Lost does not feel like content made with any self-reflection on what worked and what didn't about the base game. It's just a nonsensical rehash of the surface elements of the original. Put it another way, Postal 2 Paradise Lost is the Blues Brothers 2000 of gaming. It feels pointless alongside the original game. It certainly doesn't feel like something official. It feels like a fan-made mod instead. It has all the graceless enthusiasm of a mod, the rough edges, the cheap workarounds, the obvious cut corners, but also the obvious love of the game itself. Postal 2 is a game about pointlessly dicking around as a player. Paradise Lost is a game about pointlessly dicking around as developers on a game design level. You can see this pretty clearly in how Running with Scissors inserted themselves into the game, even more ridiculously and at greater length than ever before. Vince Desiderio leads a cult of VD, cause it's both his initials and, like, venereal disease, so that's some kind of joke. The literally trademarked Postal babes digitally jiggle in the background while Postal art covers the walls of the church. The church altar is covered in all the different retail variations of Postal 1 and 2. And then there's the tasks that Vince gives you in the game. Sabotage a rival, replace circuit boards at the arcade with Running with Scissors products. In the latter case, the arcade owner refuses the circuit boards because he abhors violent video games, on account of how he's an arms smuggler and it might blow his cover. Just like with the protesters on day one of the base game, critics of Running with Scissors are portrayed in the game as liars and hypocrites. The rival developer is PU Games, which is not actually a company made up of two 8-year-olds in an overcoat pretending to be an adult, but a thinly veiled version of Tim Schafer's company Double Fine. There's posters for Waste Base DS9, a reference to Double Fine's notoriously broken and incomplete space management sim, in addition to Psycho Nuts, with a jab saying that Schafer has ridden that game's goodwill for a decade with nothing else to show for it. Astoundingly, this is indeed criticism coming from a company that is not only responsible for the existence of Postal 3, but one whose list of published games consists solely of Postal 1, 2, 3, and the variations thereof. The idea is that Schafer is a money-grubbing hack with no creativity and a big ego, in a game where the developer put in a literal shrine to themselves and their decade-old accomplishments in a level recycled completely from their previous game. It is the most petty thing I've ever seen a developer put in a game that wasn't DLC. The vibe you get from Running with Scissors is so often a petulant and resentful one. They come from an era where big personalities defined development houses. Id and John Carmack, Richard Garrio and Origin, Sid Meier and Firaxis. Vince Desiderio obviously wanted to be one of those names. To have his company and his personality indivisible from each other, which he kinda did, but he never became a household name. Desiderio being shitty about Schafer is supposed to come off like an edgy, outsider indie developer, that would be Running with Scissors, taking well-deserved shots at a vapid industry insider, that would be Double Fine. Except that Schafer is also an indie developer. They are peers. Could it be that Double Fine has found greater success than Running with Scissors because they have had more than one idea for a game since 1997, even if you don't like those games very much? PU Games is less parody, more Desiderio's version of Liza Minnelli singing Maybe This Time. Would it especially surprise you that Running with Scissors is one of a tiny handful of development houses to publicly support Gamergate? Running with Scissors have always seen themselves as an on-held underdog, brilliant in all ways, but never recognized because of the poisonous hypocrisy of their critics. That was how Running with Scissors felt about gaming journalism in 2003. It is less accurate to say that Running with Scissors joined Gamergate than it is to say that Gamergate joined Running with Scissors. From the company's official Tumblr, here's a quote. Those of us who are in it for the love of the game choose to simply make the games that we want to make and then let their quality and merit determine their success in the market. We let our games stand on their own. However, there are always those who are strictly in it for personal attention and profit, willing to resort to dirty, underhanded tactics to achieve results, and there are always those on the other end of the industry, more than happy to lend a helping hand for personal gain. It's a billion-dollar industry, billions of dollars being spent by gamers, casual and hardcore alike, who are just looking for some entertainment. And everyone wants a slice of the billion-dollar pie, whether they've earned it or not. It's quite heartbreaking to watch truly great games, that are obviously made with a lot of heart and passion, go unnoticed and left behind in favor of shoddy games that don't seem nearly as deserving of the attention. Of course, he's talking about Depression Quest and the indie adventure craze in general. In a different pro-Gamergate post, he speculates on the reasons that people might say negative things about the Postal franchise. Quote, could it be that the people doing all the complaining are simply looking for their 15 minutes of fame or a way to make easy money without too much actual work? If you are a good talker, it is fairly easy to broadcast almost anything over the internet and find gullible people who actually believe and support whatever drivel you may be spouting. We can only recommend that you take a serious look at your games and form your own opinions. Does a computer drawing, no matter how artistic, actually make you want to go out and create misery and mayhem toward your fellow man? Or is it just somebody seeking publicity telling you that it will? The sad fact is that there have always been bad people, and there always probably will be. What was violence towards women or any other negative behavior blamed on before technology? Did the cow on the North 40 acres look at you funny, so you had to go home and beat your wife? Your horse threw a shoe, so you had no choice but to torture and kill your neighbor lady? Do the people who are doing all the complaining even believe what they are saying to themselves, or is it just their way of seeking attention? You will have to decide for yourself. Who knows? Perhaps the loudest and longest feminist nitpicker and complainer simply suffers from an overwhelming case of joystick envy. Again, that is a quote from the official company Tumblr page. This is amazing to me. Amazing because it seems that Desiderio really does not understand that he's been making niche products this entire time. If you want to talk hypocrisy, here's one. A developer whose entire marketing scheme and design philosophy is founded on being self-consciously offensive, and then is flabbergasted by the idea that so many of the critics of the game are offended by it. Surely, they are simply complaining for attention because games about being a sarcastic, psychopathic jackass have a universal appeal that is only stifled by a liberal bias in the media. Or, hang on, because this is a complicated point, perhaps people think this deliberately gross game is gross and are not impressed by it. On the one hand, the idea that this game is only really appealing to the small slice of gamers who actually do relate to the Postal dude. On the other, the idea that this cheaply produced DLC for a decade-old asshole simulator is so good that only an international conspiracy of angry feminists can halt its spread into the hearts and minds of millions. I'm not unsympathetic to Desiderio wanting a big ol' pat on the back for the passion his team puts into its product, but those products are so shitty to so many different sorts of people that it turns most gamers off. Desiderio is like a comedian who blames an apathetic crowd for their inability to appreciate true comedy rather than blame himself for failing to engage them. There was no way Postal 1 or 2 were ever going to be bestsellers, but they do incredibly well in their niche. Running with Scissors has moved over 750,000 games through Steam's digital distribution services. There are people who love the games, people to whom the Postal dude does function as an everyman. This game will not sell to anyone outside of that niche market, period. It's loud, it's crude, it's hopelessly dated. Everything it does successfully is done better in other games. Frequently, Running with Scissors has wondered why game critics enjoy Grand Theft Auto in preference to Postal, why they are less irritated by the violence and racism and sexism in that franchise. Well, for one, those games are not solely about being obnoxiously gross. Being an asshole is a big component, but your motivations are criminal, financial, and based in narrative. The gameplay offers more tactical options than Postal ever did. The driving is wonderful. The cities are digital works of art. Desiderio genuinely thinks that media bias and grudges towards running with scissors are the reason why his games get worse press. He will not entertain the possibility that his games are not as impressive as products, that they are more limited in scope and ambition, that they are made with less care and confidence, that they rely so heavily on sophomoric humor that it alienates people who want a less obnoxious game experience. GTA has a lot of the exact same kind of humor, especially with in-game ads, but they blend it into the background of the world. Paradise Lost isn't even really made to appeal to any audience. It's made exactly the way Running with Scissors feels like doing it, and screw everyone else besides the merry few for whom these jokes actually resonate. Desiderio used to have more confidence in the face of criticism that the game harnesses for marketing purposes. When Computer Gaming World wrote in its 2003 review, "Until someone boxes up syphilis and tries to sell it at retail, Postal 2 is the worst product ever foisted upon consumers," Running with Scissors printed that quote on the back of the box. When it comes to Paradise Lost, Desiderio took a less confident stance, insisting his game has no problem with sexism or anything else, and that suggestions to the contrary are idiotic, while at the same time making the boss of the game the Postal Dude's ex-wife, who grows fatter and more demonic as the fight progresses, and as she hurls insults at your manhood towards the player. I am not kidding at all. Here's Desiderio on Paradise Lost and Women. It's a partial quote. He goes on at length, but this is his opening salvo. Quote, "Running with Scissors is pleased to see that our name and the Postal games were not generally mentioned in any of the many recent outcries against the treatment of women in video games. That leaves us to believe that our carefully controlled and cloud-soft handling of the ladies is more along the line of what is acceptable to our feminist friends. We are more than happy to oblige, of course. Our man, the Dude, will always defend his Postal babes to the death." Here is a quick quote from Gamergate icon Milo Yiannopoulos and his quick look at Paradise Lost that he wrote for Breitbart. He also happens to appear in the game briefly as himself and did voice work for Paradise Lost. He said, "As I wrote in November, I've written scathingly in the past about so-called ultra-violent video games, but that's before I discovered Postal 2, and began to appreciate the nihilistic abandon of chasing a fat bird down the street, tasing her from behind, and then lopping off her head with a shovel. Mea maxima culpa." Full quote. And now I'd like to take a moment and let Paradise Lost speak for itself.
"You can't die! I love you, bitch! I'll save you with my life-giving man milk!"
Well, shit. Now I recognize her. Anyway, I think my business is done here. Can I go now?
Homewrecker! This is all your fault! You've ruined my wedding day and turned my hot bitch of a wife into a fat slag! You are banished from my junkyard, and I'll make certain that all zombie kind will condemn you for all eternity!
You know, I think I'm just fine with that.
And that's just the first time you run into the bitch, which is her only name. She reappears in the game's final boss fight, and it's divided into two stages. In the first stage, she becomes fatter and fatter and has attacks based around crushing and slamming the Postal Dude around. Then she awkwardly stumbles off a cliff into a whirlpool of lava. Then she reappears as a gigantic, even more grotesque demon, his ex-wife's true form, hideous and terrible in all ways. She has attacks that crush the Postal Dude with her mighty fists, and an attack where she inhales the player into her stomach and you have to shoot your way out. When you finally do reduce that big ol' health bar to 0, here's what happens.
You asshole! You spineless worm! You think you've won here? You haven't won anything! You haven't achieved a single thing in your worthless life! You're nothing but a deadbeat! You were a terrible husband, you couldn't hold a job, you couldn't perform in bed, you couldn't even complete a simple list of chores. And worst of all, you never brought me my rocky road!
I wouldn't have expected that coming from you. I suppose I appreciate your help back there.
That's no problem. In retrospect, I think we may have a bit more in common than you think.
Well, maybe there's some good in that twisted mind of yours after all. Thanks.
Trust me, it was no trouble at all. I regret nothing.
According to Steam achievements, 1.4% of players who own Postal 2 have beaten Paradise Lost. I think it's pretty clear that hardly anyone talked about this scene because hardly anyone bothered to play this far in the game. The boss fight's design and running with scissors political posturing is pretty much Gamergate in a nutshell. You start by making incredibly long, self-righteous screeds about your freedom of expression and against the idea that games are an artistic medium, in favor of seeing them as a commercial product. Then you misinterpret criticism and assume bad faith on everyone else's part, while at the same time your actual creative output is so cringeworthy and tasteless that it reflects more poorly on the creator than any second-hand criticism ever actually could. That boss fight is the most transcendently childish, idiotic, and yes, sexist thing I've seen in a game. There are two kinds of gamers who might genuinely like this kind of shit. Bitter, angry adult gamers with a lot of resentment to get out, and teenagers looking for the right piece of software to make mom and dad mad. Before you think I'm the one characterizing Postal's audience as aging bitter loners, though, here's one more quote from Milo Yiannopoulos on why he champions Gamergate from an interview with Fusion.net. Quote, "There aren't many people who would stick up for an odd guy with no money who lives in Wisconsin, hates his wife, plays video games to escape from his miserable life, and is suddenly told that just because he likes playing Grand Theft Auto, that he's a sexist, misogynist pig. I feel for that guy." I mean, right, poor guy. His only outlet for his resentment is to ignore the woman he chose to make a life with and play games which literally demonize her. That's the crux of what is so deeply and intractably obnoxious about Paradise Lost. It has a self-image of being so fun and creative that no one could resist. It has an actual image of being a rolling boulder of compacted shit, and its offensive humor is not somehow made delightful by the fact that Desiderio meant to be offensive. It is offensive and cringeworthy to most people, men and women. It's not a feminist thing. This game is bitter, petty, and sophomoric. Sophomoric coming from a guy who's had over a decade to grow comedically and professionally, but circled back, ultimately, to the same product he's made for 18 years. Actual full human beings have grown up in the time since Vince Desiderio started making games about refusing to do so. The thing is, if Running with Scissors would just own the fact that they make a willfully abrasive product for a niche of gamers to whom politically incorrect is a virtue, and not a sign that you're about to have your time wasted, what would it really matter what anyone thought? In 1997, Postal was deliberately and successfully controversial, because for every 4 people who said, "What is this shit?" the 5th might think, it might be fun. In 2015, their failure to engage 5 out of 5 gamers is a sign that those gamers probably aren't even real gamers, because only an anti-fun moron would dislike this hilarious retread of the humor and values and graphics of fringe gaming circa 2003. Everyone else is a pack of liars and hypocrites, but not Running with Scissors or Gamergate. They are the only ones brave enough to stand tall in front of the whole world and shout, once and for all, "Get out of my room, Mom! God!" Gamergate is right about one element of its self-perception, though, the part where they thought of themselves as a consumer revolt. Mainstream tastes have wandered far from the early 2000s, but only because the medium is larger and more complex than it ever has been before. Gaming in 2015 is vibrantly creative and highly experimental. Niche interests are king. It's what's allowed Running with Scissors to come back into profitability. Digital distribution means an audience with a very specific vision for games can quickly find titles that resonate, even and especially with older and out-of-print titles. AAA studios who make games with incredible complexity still fail to connect to the whole of the gaming market. I mean, take a look at what happened with the recent Mad Max. It is a fragmented market on the macro scale, but within each fragment of gaming is an intense hunger for products that fit that niche's vision of what games can or should be. Indie adventure and the much-maligned walking simulator genre are one such niche, isometric role-playing games are another such niche, and asshole simulators have a niche as well. Gamergate is primarily a movement of people who feel like gaming is leaving them behind, being drained of the things that they find fun. Their list of demands for cultural change are incomprehensibly contradictory, but their list of values when it comes to game design are crystal clear. Games are not art, they are entertainment. They should not be taken seriously or critiqued in cultural context. They should only be critiqued from a mechanical, consumer-centric viewpoint as a product. And games should be able to have any kind of content whatsoever, however offensive, without being judged as offensive. Only by their gameplay, their scale of 1 through 10 fun factor, should they be judged. Over the past year and change since Gamergate began, they have solidified into a remarkably solid block of game players. They share a vision for game. They share a hunger for validation. They are willing to throw down $40 on something they think will make their critics angry. Gamergate completely failed to form a movement for journalistic reform. Gamergate was instead wildly successful in defining an intensely profitable niche market that was, besides running with scissors titles, relatively underserved. There was a hunger for games that would not just anger mom and dad, but the whole of the liberal gaming media international feminist conspiracy. Into this coalescing submarket, Polish developer Destructive Creations released their debut title, a high-definition reimagining of the very first Postal game. It would be called simply Hatred. Hatred is possibly the most earnestly straightforward game on the market. It has no nuance, by design. Yaroslav Zelinsky, CEO of Destructive Creations, describes the main character thusly. Quote, "He isn't hiding anything behind what he does. He is full of emotions, because hate is also an emotion, as the love is. His aim is to eliminate the targets. He is not getting anything out of that. No money, no fame, no satisfaction for sadistic intents. As a sociopath, he only wants to watch the world burn. His actions aren't motivated by greed. There is a kind of purity in his behavior, because he is not trying to justify who he is and what he does, contrary to what we see in GTA, because there we also play criminals, but motivated by something less pure. You may try to look deeper and figure out on your own why Antagonist is like this. We left the explanation of his behavior to the gamers." End quote. At last, someone finally listened to the consumer and gave us a player character with one single dimension. Kidding aside, Hatred manages to out-Postal both in terms of generating press on the basis of controversy over content and improving the frivolity of video game violence by removing every layer of context through which games usually approach violence. I got an achievement for having 1,000 kills in Hatred, and in Postal 1, and in Postal 2, and I've been playing games since I was a kid, and violent games since I was 12. What's my lifetime count for digital murder? In the hundreds of thousands by now, surely. Yet I have no problem with actual human empathy. Because I'm not committing actual violence, I'm flicking a mouse. And having caused digital violence for over a decade and a half, Hatred's central design flaw is abundantly clear. Killing for the sake of killing in a game, not trying to justify what you do, not getting anything out of it, just mindlessly destroying, is a fucking snooze fest. To demonstrate, I ask this. What does Hatred do that Diablo 3 does not do better? Hatred is a top-down, ultra-violent empowerment fantasy. So is Diablo 3. Hatred populates the screen with dozens and dozens of enemies at once, and orients its gameplay so making them pop open in geysers of blood is satisfying and fun. So does Diablo 3. Hatred spends little effort on making narrative sense beyond basic motivation and tracking physical advancement through the world. Diablo 3 has a similarly minimal approach to story. Except, Hatred empowers the player to be an asshole, the antagonist, whose sole motivation is sadism. Diablo 3 empowers the players with heroic purpose and an intensely complicated system of ever-growing statistics to demonstrate the progress of a player's engagement with the world. Violence isn't just used for violence. Each kill is a pull on the lever of a slot machine, a reason to click that's mechanical, psychological, and based in greed instead of sadism. The violence in Diablo 3 is meaningless and repetitive. So the violence isn't the whole game. Diablo 3 is a numbers game, through character statistics and ability use. The violence in Hatred is also meaningless and repetitive, but without any intervening layer of context. It's meaningless to the point of wondering what's good on television or what's in the fridge. The only thing that truly sets the game apart is the setting, but games with contemporary settings are so much more common than they used to be. If you're going to go on the same murderous rampage in GTA 5, you'd be doing it in higher video fidelity with a great soundtrack backing it. Or perhaps it's the art style that sets Hatred apart, a washed-out grayscale punctuated by blood, fire, and neon. Of course, there's already been a AAA title using a similar artistic vibe, Gears of War, which is considerably more visceral and gruesome to boot when it comes to violence. That was the game that gave us the chainsaw bayonet, after all. It was just as bleak and melancholy as Hatred, but it was so much more vibrant and engaging in the gameplay, even more so in the level design. Destructive Creations is only a 13-person team. Their size and budget did not allow them to be as technically ambitious as the titles I've just listed, but choosing to write the antagonist without any motivation is not a technical shortcoming. It's a deliberate design choice to make the game stand out, to say, context for violence is pretense. This game will have purity of violence. Purity of violence is not compelling. Most people don't play for the violence alone. People play for the context. People play games for empowerment fantasies. But people love a constructive empowerment fantasy. But even then, the explorations of pure evil has been done more cohesively elsewhere, like BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic, which had dozens of moments of sadism deeper and crueler than the B-horror schlock of Hatred. Hatred tried to say, look at the games market. Who will champion violence for fun in a world where people enjoy Gone Home? Yet it shows that the things gamergaters claim are disappearing from games forever are, in fact, all around and in fine health. Hatred is not distinctive because it is a mass murder simulator. Some of the most popular games on the market simulate mass murder. How many kills does a dedicated Call of Duty player rack up during multiplayer, or even single player? Hatred is distinctive because it is only a mass murder simulator, with no further ambition. Destructive Creations outdid Running with Scissors in one other area, too. Confidence in product. Also from Zelensky's Destructoid interview, quote, to anyone who opposes social justice warriors and unethical games journalists, I would say, keep fighting. We're on your side. Well, we don't really care about the voice of the SJWs. They are a loud minority in the gaming world, and most people don't care about reviews or Metacritic anymore anyway. Me included. Many games I liked were heavily bashed by media. And besides, submission is for the weak. We won't submit to the values we don't accept. We like to do things the way we want. Zelensky states elsewhere in the interview that he wanted to redo Postal right, in the serious tone of the first game without the flippancy of the second. He did so very meticulously, even preserving the same basic order of levels from Postal, beginning at home, branching out through Siberia, a truck stop, the inner city, then a military base towards the end. But it's relatively free of the mechanical awkwardness of Postal. For what it does, for what Zelensky wanted out of his vision, it's a solid little title. It's sold like hotcakes to the Gamergate crowd, and also on the same principle as the original Postal. Any press, however negative, is free advertising for a game whose offense is intentional. Destructive Creations knows quite well how prevalent mass shootings are in real life, how much rancor and confusion surround possible solutions to the problem. They knew that people would be outraged by its tastelessness, and it is tasteless. It is completely without taste. Yet it genuinely is not half as offensive as Paradise Lost, because the entirety of its intended offense is in the violence, and the violence isn't even especially startling, outside the fact that the sadism is so explicitly woven into the premise. Like Postal, it is the premise that seems dangerous, that seems evil. As a piece of software, Hatred is entirely unremarkable, defined less by what it is than what it is not compared to other games. But, even Death Race wasn't entirely predicated on misanthropy. You weren't running down pedestrians, you were running down gremlins. Both Postal and Hatred are made by developers who place a high value on freedom of creative expression. They chose to express visions of spite, avarice, and general fuckery. A game like that will sell. A game like that will never sell as well as a game that aims higher, a game that does contextualize its violence, contextualize its humor. Random violence and random humor can carry a game, but they won't carry it as far as games which seek a wider audience. If you enjoy the Postal franchise and Hatred, I don't think you are an asshole, but you sure do play one in all of these games. That's the point of these games. Gamergate thinks that gaming is an ideological tug-of-war. It is not. It's a free market. It is a fragmented free market, wherein walking simulators and asshole simulators find their niche side by side. Just don't be surprised that the majority of gamers want to save the world, not give it the fucking finger. Thanks for watching.
Thanks again for watching. I'd like to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating over $10 a month or more on Patreon to me. People like Cameron Jackson, Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Soeb Sheik, Balder Carlson, Dennis Clark, Maxwell Reed, Nick Cole Hamilton, Andrew Foltz, Kevin DeBolt, Jake Brennan, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Igor Bebyuk, Niles D. McDonald, Seth Downing, Justin Hughes, Kumarin Vajayan, Nobody, Jared Meyer, Philip Marthron, Dylan Sibley, David Fry, David Reed, Josh, Boris Nielsen, Michael Atwell, Eugene Watson, Cameron, Alexander Leister, David Gilbreth, Trolls Katzberg Siegwert, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albuck, B-Tree, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Galak, Brett Guillermo, Martin Sconning, Finn Spencer, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Colin, Brad Carr, Ivan Marinov, Josh Farks, Chris Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Dan Reeder, Dewey, Annax of Rhodes, Niels Bach-Frommer, Spyro Sedaris, Rob Clark, Matthew Lagden, Harley McAvoy, Jump Kick Punch, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua VV, Tizer Vicarian, Irvin, Brad Smith, Connor Biblo, Ryan Gunst, Preston Allen, Sergio, Sigmund Copperroad, Stephen Lark, Amir Aguilar, Jeffrey Knutson, Pontus Pfaffenstiel, D. Kimmo Heikkinen, Joe Wolf, Sangustin, Oliver Hendliken, White Zero, Stephen Rubio, Yuri Petnes, Sill, and Jonathan Fleickner, as well as the many others who are helping out with smaller amounts.
Now, an incredible bore. All the best of the game is in the backgrounds. The most distinctive and memorable thing about Postal is how all the violence looks so amazingly at home against the understated, straightforward environments. It's the only really unique thing about Postal. For all the creativity of games, especially at the time, the emphasis was almost always on fantasy worlds, places exotic and new. Postal is about an incredibly drab, worn-out present. Your little psychopath is tired of the world, and as you move through it, there's a distinct artistic impression that the world is tired of itself as well. Of course, that's artistry in spite of their intentions. Running with Scissors is a company very committed to the idea that games are for fun and not to be used for artistic purposes. It's not a trend they kept up, regardless. These handcrafted levels are the last things Running with Scissors ever put out that you might be able to refer to as understated. From this point on, it's going to be all over the top, all the time, especially the gameplay, because here in Postal 1, the mechanics are completely underwhelming and very repetitive. It's what's called an isometric top-down shooter. And it was a PC-only release. You move with the arrows, you pivot with the mouse, and you don't stop until you kill everybody. There's a number of weapons, but the awkwardness of moving and aiming never gets better. Plus, the way that the boundaries of drawn objects in the background are incorporated as 3D objects into the world is inconsistent. You never really can tell where your missiles and grenades are going to get jammed up on the environment. It feels like succeeding in Postal is more about luck than about skill. What you need is nice little clumps of enemies and tight corridors, and you can certainly manipulate your digital victims into these circumstances, but the AI tends to be either incredibly aggressive or completely oblivious. You mostly end up with swarms of angry police and isolated strangers whistling with their hands in their pockets. No mitigating layer of aliens or monsters or world-saving. It's just killing for killing's sake. Also, like Death Race, the reality of the game feels like so much less than that. Your psychopathic killer is a little mass of moody-colored blocks firing orange and yellow dots at other block blobs to make little red dots pour out of them, against a hand-painted background. Ultimately, it is just a cartoon. That was the idea behind titles like Doom and Quake as well, that all the violence within is cartoonish, that you weren't seeing any dynamic not already explored by Tom and Jerry, except now it was a networked competition with rocket launchers. Postal did not sell itself that way. Instead, its developer, Running with Scissors, took advantage of the climate of scrutiny the video games were getting in the wake of Doom's unprecedented impact on pop culture. They made a game that was sure to offend some people, hell, maybe most people, and that was their ticket to success, because for every 4 people who are like, "Can you believe this shit?" the 5th will consider buying it. Controversy profiteering is nothing new in entertainment, but Postal may be the first runaway success to use the advertising tactic in video games. It works perfectly. If you know nothing about computer games, which is the majority of people in 1997, it sounds like a seriously nasty game. But anyone who actually played it is confronted by something else entirely, a game defined not so much by its sharp edges, but by its abiding mediocrity. Sure, this is a game where the people you injure crawl across the ground begging for help, and you have a special button on the keyboard to execute them point blank. But it's also a game that doesn't tell you which key ends the level and then makes fun of you for how long it took you to smash all the keys looking for it. It's a game about pure, unadulterated sadism. It is a game that, despite that foundation of avarice, is somehow tiny stick figures that the game said were monsters. What made people so uncomfortable, what made retailers and arcade owners too nervous to actually stock the machine, was the idea that they were selling a self-indulgently violent fantasy. They were already in the fantasy sales business, but how deep did the rabbit hole go? What kind of fantasies were marketable, and which were too far? Flash forward to 1997, the year Postal was released. While Postal was coming out, the groundbreakingly violent first-person shooter Doom was seeing its day in court. Lawyer Jack Thompson, in the wake of the Heath High shootings, sued not only id Software, but several other game developers, as well as 2 porn websites and the distributors of the movies Natural Born Killers and, weirdly, The Basketball Diaries, which features a scene of fantasy violence that Thompson argued influenced the Heath High shooter. Thompson was trying to sue pop culture itself. The shooting was horrific, as was Columbine, as have been every one of the hundreds of school shootings since 1997. But the shooter's preoccupation with video game violence was an expression of mental instability and not the cause. In 2001, an appeals court finally dismissed the case, saying it was, quote, simply too far a leap from shooting characters on a video screen to shooting people in a classroom. Postal was never included in this lawsuit. It had just been released when proceedings began. And that's for the best. It brought some interesting and complicated new dimensions to the argument. How do you defend a game about doing the indefensible? What place in popular culture does a murder simulation have? I'm not being hyperbolic. That's the premise. You play a psychopathic killer on a murder spree. Once you've killed enough people, a majority percentage, you can move on to the next level. Like Death Race, what is controversial is the context, the idea that it's a game with sadism as the central premise, with no...
Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. Today we're going to be looking at a subgenre of games that I'm trying to call asshole simulators. Really is what they are. Postal and Hatred are games where you play a psychotic mass murderer. Postal 2 and 3 are games where you play a psychotic mass murderer with jokes. All of these games are predicated on the idea that they are controversial and offensive, but not to the player, right? So we're going to be getting deep into how the games are designed and why the games are designed that way and how it actually turns out for each of the titles and all the expansions for Postal 2 as well. Let's get into it.
The first video game ever to be banned from sale due to objectionable content was Death Race, an arcade cabinet from 1976. In it, you drive a little pixelated car and try to run down gremlins who would gurgle a digital death rattle and be replaced by a tombstone, which would wreck your car if you hit it. The more gremlins you could kill without hitting their tombstones, the higher your score. It's just dots on a screen anyway. How could anyone have gotten so upset about it? Death Race was something culturally new in 1976, a game with a sadistic premise. It's not the pixels that bothered people. The game was bloodless. You weren't even running down pedestrians. Their level plays the same, tactically. It's just the backgrounds that shake things up. Sometimes, though, you get a little moment of dark humor that actually works, like the marching band. This level starts you off in a suburban downtown during a parade. The marching band is just coming up. What's a guy with a bandolier of Molotov cocktails and a nasty disposition to do? It's so cartoonish that it is, in fact, pretty funny. A cheap, interactive, ultra-violent knockoff of the climax to Animal House. And it's just pretend, after all. As willfully awful as Postal is, its frivolity of purpose and frivolity of impact are shockingly workable as a foil for everything that goes on in the game. The last level of Postal takes place in an elementary school, and it's here that running with scissors actually made a choice that makes the game a somewhat worthwhile exploration of video game violence, and not, the most tasteless thing ever released. Postal 3 gets that honor. Here in the first game, the Postal dude's visit to the elementary school is not interactive or violent. It's a bait and switch. After so many levels of carnage and death named simply after what kind of place you're going to be doing the killing in, seeing the elementary school pop up provokes an immediate, visceral response of the player. Nope. That is too fucking far. And then the game agrees with you. The Postal dude cannot hurt the children. He's hallucinating. The end cinematic shows us that the Postal dude is actually in a cell at a mental institution, and this entire game has been a psychotic delusion. And that's really what it is. Postal is an interactive version of the doodles you make in the margins of the newspaper when the person next to you on the bus won't shut up, a gamified version of everything you've ever fantasized about doing to other drivers during rush hour. We all have violent urges, Postal says. Don't be so serious about it. Games are just fantasy, and for all however tasteless